There is a document in the National Archives dated 1923. It is a federal report, and buried in its appendix is a sentence that stopped me cold. It estimates that somewhere between 20 and 40% of all American births before 1900 were never recorded anywhere. Not in a courthouse, not in a church, not in a hospital, nowhere. Those children existed. They grew up. They had families of their own. And according to every official record the government ever kept, they were never born. I found this while searching for my own family. I was trying to trace a great-great-grandmother listed in the 1880 census as female, age unknown. No birth record, no baptism entry, no midwife log, nothing. I assumed the records had been lost. What I found instead was something far more structural, far more deliberate. The records were never created in the first place. This is the story of how an entire generation of Americans, tens of millions of them, entered the world without a single piece of paper to prove it, and why that erasure still shapes what we know and don't know about who we are. The official explanation is simple. Record keeping was decentralized. The United States left vital statistics, births, marriages, deaths, to individual states, and states, for most of the 19th century, left it to counties. And counties left it to whoever happened to be nearby when a child arrived. Reasonable, except for one detail. By 1880, the federal government was already tracking everything else: agricultural output by county, railroad mileage by township, the number of horses in Iowa, the precise tonnage of pig iron produced in Pennsylvania. The Census Bureau, by that decade, was one of the most sophisticated data collection operations in the world. But births? Untracked. The first attempt at a national birth registration standard came in 1850. The census that year asked enumerators to collect birth data for the first time. The results were so incomplete, less than 1/3 of estimated births were captured, that the effort was quietly discontinued after a single decade. Reasonable, perhaps. The infrastructure wasn't there. But here is the detail that does not fit. No replacement system was proposed for 40 years. Not a revision, not a pilot program, not a federal recommendation. 40 years of official silence on the question of whether American babies existed. But this was only the first gap. By 1870, most European nations had functioning civil birth registration systems. France had required universal birth registration since 1800. England since 1837. Germany since 1876. The United States was not a poor country in 1870. It was industrializing at a pace that stunned European observers. It had a functioning postal system, a national banking network, and a federal bureaucracy capable of conscripting over 2 million men for the Civil War. It could find men to fight. It could not find a system to count their children. The official explanation: federalism. States' rights. The federal government had no constitutional authority to mandate civil registration. Reasonable, except that the federal government was simultaneously distributing land grants, collecting tariffs, and regulating interstate commerce, all without apparent constitutional anxiety. The federalism argument was selective. It applied to births and deaths. It did not apply to railroads. And then there were the states themselves. By 1880, only Massachusetts, New Jersey, and a handful of New England states had functioning birth registration systems with meaningful compliance rates. In the South, registration was nearly non-existent. In the Midwest and West, it was voluntary at best. A physician or midwife might file a certificate, or might not. A parent might register a birth at the county clerk's office, or might not. There was no penalty for failing to register. There was no follow-up. There was no audit. For the 46 states outside New England, the birth of a child was, legally speaking, a private event. What happened next is more disturbing than the absence of records itself. In 1893, the American Public Health Association drafted a model vital statistics law. It was not radical. It simply proposed that states adopt standardized forms and require registration within 10 days of birth. It was circulated to every state legislature in the country. 23 states ignored it entirely. 11 states passed watered-down versions with no enforcement mechanisms. The remaining states passed it and then failed to fund the collection offices needed to implement it. The model law existed on paper for over a decade before anyone built the system to carry it out. And during that decade, roughly 1893 to 1907, an estimated 12 to 15 million children were born in the United States. The majority of them in states with no functioning registration system. 12 to 15 million children, 1 decade, no paper. In 1908, the Census Bureau published its first systematic analysis of birth registration completeness across the country. The findings were presented matter-of-factly, in the dry language of statistical administration. But the numbers beneath that language are extraordinary. The Bureau identified what it called the birth registration area, the states and territories whose registration systems were reliable enough to be used for national statistics. In 1915, when the area was formally established, it included 10 states and the District of Columbia. 10 out of 48. The remaining 38 states were considered statistically unreliable. Consider what that means on the ground. In 1915, not 1840, not the frontier era, but 1915, the same year Ford was mass-producing automobiles and Congress was debating the income tax, if you were born in Texas, you were probably unregistered. If you were born in Georgia, probably unregistered. Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, the Dakotas, Nebraska, Oklahoma. Probably unregistered. Georgia did not join the birth registration area until 1928, Texas until 1933, Wyoming until 1921, Nevada until 1920, Arkansas waited until 1927. Read that timeline slowly. 1915, 10 states have reliable registration. 1920, 17 states. 1925, 31 states. 1930, 40 states. 1933, 48 states. Finally, full national coverage. 48 years after the telephone was invented. 27 years after the first airplane flight. 13 years after the First World War. And this timeline only counts registration. It does not count accuracy. The Census Bureau's own audits from the 1920s found that even in registered states, African American births were undercounted by between 30 and 50%. Births attended by midwives, which was the majority of rural births, black and white, were underregistered relative to physician-attended births by a factor of nearly 3 to 1. Maybe I'm seeing a pattern that isn't there. Maybe this was simply an administrative lag, a country catching up with itself. Maybe the under-registration of black births was local negligence, not structural design. But then I look at who bore the consequences. And the picture shifts. Because in 1917, the United States entered the First World War. And for the first time, the federal government required proof of age for draft registration. Suddenly, the absence of birth records had legal teeth. Men who could not document their age faced bureaucratic limbo. The solution, developed rapidly and with little fanfare, was the delayed birth certificate, a document a person could apply for in adulthood using secondary evidence like family Bibles, school records, or affidavits from witnesses. The government had spent decades building no system to record births. It then built an emergency system to reconstruct them after the fact. Secondary evidence, oral testimony, family memory. The archive it failed to create, it now required citizens to recreate themselves. I want you to think about a specific person, not a statistic. A woman born in 1885 in rural Alabama. Her mother delivered her at home, attended by a neighbor woman with no medical training and no legal obligation to file anything. No certificate was prepared. No county clerk was notified. In the records of the state of Alabama in 1885, this woman does not exist. She grew up. She married. Her husband's name entered the record. Men were tracked through land ownership, tax rolls, voter registration, military service. She entered the record only when attached to him. She had children. If those children were born before Alabama joined the birth registration area in 1927, they too were invisible. 3 generations of a family, living full lives, anchored to no official documentation of origin. When her grandchildren tried to collect Social Security in the 1960s, they needed a birth certificate. They did not have one. They applied for a delayed certificate. The secondary evidence they could provide, a family Bible entry, a school enrollment record from 1904, was sometimes accepted, sometimes not. The Social Security Administration denied approximately 400,000 delayed birth certificate applications between 1960 and 1975 on grounds of insufficient documentation. 400,000 people, in living memory, told by the federal government that they could not sufficiently prove they existed. Genealogists have a term for this. They call it the brick wall, the generation where the family tree simply stops, where names become initials and ages become approximations and birthplaces become question marks. For most American families researching ancestors born before 1900, that brick wall is not a mystery. It is a structural feature of a system that was never designed to see them. 63 million Americans alive today are descended from at least one person who was born before 1915 in a state that had no functioning birth registration. I want you to sit with that number. 63 million living people whose family tree contains at least one generation that the government decided, by inaction, not to count. And within those 63 million, the burden is not equally distributed. African American families, rural Southern families, immigrant families who gave birth before naturalization, indigenous families whose births were recorded only when they intersected with federal Indian policy. These communities carry brick walls not by accident, but by design of neglect. Grandmothers who knew exactly where they were born, exactly what year, exactly which midwife attended, and whose certainty collided in their old age with a bureaucratic system that said, "Show me the paper." There was no paper. There was never supposed to be, and yet, the traces remain. They always do. The family Bible was the primary birth record for most American families throughout the 19th century. Not a government document, not a legal instrument, a book kept on a shelf, passed from mother to daughter. The National Archives estimates that family Bibles containing birth records survive for more American families than any other pre-registration source. Churches are second. Baptismal registers, confirmation records, burial logs. Many of these have been digitized in the last 2 decades. Many have not. Some sit in the basements of rural congregations that have no idea what they hold. County deed records are another archive the erasure missed. Land transfers routinely referenced birth years, ages, relationships. A deed from 1865 might mention John being of legal age, born the 3rd of April, 1844. Not a birth certificate, but a date, a name, an anchor. Midwife logs are rarer, but they exist. The Kentucky State Archives holds partial logs from several African American midwives practicing in rural counties between 1890 and 1930. Names, dates. Sometimes the name of the mother, sometimes the father, sometimes only the neighborhood. The women who attended these births kept their own records without official instruction because they understood something the state did not, that a life unrecorded is a life that can be contested. The Freedmen's Bureau, operating between 1865 and 1872, collected extraordinary documentation of formerly enslaved people, names, family relationships, birth years, Former plantations. This archive was largely unknown to the public until the 1990s, when historians and genealogists began systematically digitizing it. Millions of names. Preserved not because the government intended to preserve them, but because an underfunded, short-lived bureau employed clerks who were thorough. The documents preserve what the encyclopedias ignored. And if you know where to look, the Freedmen's Bureau records at the National Archives, the digitized church registers at Family Search, the county deed indices at Ancestry, the midwife logs at state historical societies. The erasure is not total. It was never total. Erasure by neglect leaves different marks than erasure by fire. Neglect has gaps, and gaps, if you know how to read them, tell you exactly where the record should have been. In 1933, the last American state joined the birth registration area. From that year forward, every child born in this country received, within days of arrival, a legal document attesting to their existence. That gap, from the founding of the Republic to 1933, contains somewhere between 150 and 200 million births. By the Census Bureau's own estimates, somewhere between 30 and 40% of those births, in the states and years of non-registration, were never documented anywhere. 50 to 80 million people entered the world, left no official trace. The question I keep returning to is not conspiratorial. It is simpler than that, and harder to dismiss. The United States government, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, was extraordinarily capable of counting what it wanted to count. It counted cattle. It counted miles of telegraph wire. It counted the assessed value of farmland in each township. It built a postal system that reached every rural address in the country. It ran a census every 10 years that, however imperfect, attempted to find every human being on American soil. It did not build a system to record births for 157 years. And the people most thoroughly uncounted were the people who had the least power to demand otherwise. The family Bibles remember. The midwife logs remember. The Freedmen's Bureau clerks remembered. The traces are there, in basements and archives and digitized collections that most people will never search. But the official record, the one that gets cited, the one that gets taught, the one that tells us who was here and when and in what numbers, that record has a gap in it as wide as generations. And somewhere in that gap is the ancestor you've been looking for. Once you see the shape of that silence, you cannot unhear it.